You're listening to a Roddenberry podcast.
Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. Supplemental number 84. Star Trek Voyager Series Wrap-Up Part 2. The one with Ken Biller.
Welcome into a supplemental episode of Mission Log, a Roddenberry Star Trek podcast. I'm John Champion.
And I'm Earl Green. Each week on Mission Log, we examine an episode of Star Trek looking for the morals, meanings, and messages. Unless it's like today, because that is not what we are doing today.
The bit never gets old, Earl. It never gets old when we do a supplemental episode and we have a special guest. But no, today it is time again to look back lovingly, to reflect on our time in the Delta Quadrant. And this time, we've got a special guest who created some of your favorite Voyager stories.
Ken Biller's time on Voyager goes from soup to nuts, starting out as executive story editor on Season 1 and seeing the whole thing through by co-writing the series finale, Endgame.
And with that, welcome to Mission Log, Ken. We're so glad that you could join us and walk us through our journey from the farthest outreach of the Delta Quadrant back home safely to Earth. We do thank you.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
I am going to get right into it. And I preface this whole thing by saying that Mission Log is conversational. We do a deep dive into topics of moral importance, philosophical, ethical stories that are told by Star Trek. Part of the reason that you are here today is that we've finished our episode-by-episode look at Voyager. But I remember back a couple of years ago, Trek Talks, the annual fundraiser for Hollywood Food Coalition, we did a special panel about Tuvix. And you were one of those special guests on that episode, or on that live stream panel. And when the panel was over, you came back into the green room and said to all assembled there was so much more to say.
Oh boy, you've really put me on the spot. Hopefully I remember what I had to say. Let's see.
Well, I mean, let's just kind of take the 30,000-foot view first.
Sure.
Okay, Tuvix, we have a classic Star Trek transporter gone wrong episode. Go back to TOS, it was the enemy within splitting Kirk apart, and this time ago, nope, we're going to combine two distinct personalities into this new character. And then we get to live with them for a while. And then we have this, I guess Janeway's Kobayashi Maru. We have a choice at the end of the episode that she has to make. All right, before we get into the details there, what brought it on? Why are we still debating this episode 25 plus years later? It has become, it's the show that has launched 1,000 memes still.
Yeah, it's funny. I wasn't aware, until, I don't know, a couple of years ago, I guess, that it had become, as you said, such a talked about episode. I started getting people trying to DM me on Instagram who were in graduate school and writing a thesis about Tuvix. I participated in the documentary that was recently put together for the 30th anniversary of Star Trek by Garrett and Lolita. Yeah. And everybody wanted to talk about Tuvix. And so I didn't realize that it had become, such a big deal. But since it got back on my radar, it seems to come up often when I do these kinds of discussions. And I don't do these kinds of discussions that often, but I'm happy to talk about Tuvix. How it came about, to the best of my recollection, because as I've just mentioned, it was probably close to 30 years ago that I worked on the episode.
I'm curious from the start. I mean, was this a situation where you go like, you know what? I know my Star Trek. I know there's a transporter. I know we can do a technology-based story that then gets into character. Or were you starting from a point of going, well, wait a minute. There's this moral, deeply philosophical question here. The ultimate trolley problem for.
No, it did not. It did not even remotely start with this big moral question. On Voyager and on the other Star Trek series, we did something unusual back in the day, which was we would take pitches from outside writers, some of whom went on to become very successful Star Trek writers. I'm pretty sure, for example, Rene Echevarria started his Star Trek career by pitching a story that got bought, and he wrote a teleplay.
Ron Moore, but yeah, bunch of Oscars.
Ron Moore. So it was a way that unfortunately doesn't exist so much anymore, but that allowed people to break in. And there were a couple of great guys named Andrew Price and Mark Gaberman. I think they sold a few stories to Voyager over the years. And they came in and pitched what became Tuvix, and we bought the story, and then I got assigned by Michael Piller to write the teleplay. And a little fun fact about Andrew and Mark is they were also for many years, they were writers on Jeopardy. They wrote questions on Jeopardy. And in fact, they once made me an answer on Jeopardy, which made me a little bit 15 tiny seconds of fame with my nerdy relatives who happened to be watching Jeopardy. I can't remember exactly, but the question was, this episode of Star Trek written by Ken Biller, etc. And the answer was, I don't know, what is Star Trek Voyager was the question.
See,
for the answer.
If only that had been a question when Lisa Klink was on Jeopardy.
Yes, yeah. I didn't realize till many years later I'm a big Jeopardy fan, and I was watching reruns, and I said, "Oh my God, Lisa's on Jeopardy! That would have been amazing." She clearly would have known the answer, right? Very, very smart woman, Lisa Klink. But Andrew and Mark didn't tell me they were doing that. By the way, I got an email from my Uncle Harvey in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, who said, "Hey, you were just an answer on Jeopardy." So, nice. So that was kind of a thrill. Anyway. We bought this story from Andrew and Mark, and my recollection, and I preface all of this by saying that, the sands of time may have buried some of my recollections, or at least clouded them up. But they pitched the story, and yes, it was just a classic. It was an idea that we thought was kind of a funny idea, a transporter accident that merged these two characters who really were didn't always get along so well, at least in the world of Star Trek. It's more like Neelix, of course. My recollection is always wanted to please Tuvok, but Tuvok was very annoyed by Neelix, and it seemed like a funny idea. And my recollection, in fact, is that we when we originally broke the story, and I might have even written a draft or rewritten a story document, and Brandon and I, and I'm guessing Jerry Taylor at the time, we really approached it as a comedy. It would be very funny, wouldn't it, if you took these two disparate characters with different traits and you made them into a new kind of alien. And of course it was Star Trek, so there was a scientific component. This is a little fun factoid. The original title of the show was Symbiogenesis. Symbiogenesis was and I believe we discussed it, I believe, in the pilot, but it's a real evolutionary phenomenon where in some very rare circumstances, and I think it's usually happens with plants, don't quote me on this, you can get all the letters from the botanist, but when two species through some in very rare conditions end up merging and creating a new third species. And so this was the kind of the scientific reality, let's say, behind the concept that we turned into an episode. And we really approached it, I think, at first as a comedy, and I think Brandon and I thought it was pretty funny. We actually we thought it was kind of a goofy idea, ye old transporter accident. We actually created a little theme song for Tuvix that we would go around singing in the writer's room, and it was something like this. I can't sing, so I apologize, but it was like, he's Tuvok, he's Neelix, he's two guys in a fix, he's Tuvix. So we thought this was very funny, and I'm sure we worked very hard on it. We constructed all the beats of the story, and we turned it in, and it was called Symbiogenesis. And what happened was the great Michael Piller responded to this with one of his famous memos. I think by this point, Michael was not running Voyager on a day-to-day basis. I believe Jerry was running it, but Michael was still a consulting producer and, of course, a co-creator of the show. And, of course, we always wanted to know what Michael thought. And generally, he would write us a memo with thoughts and ideas either about a story or a script when the script came out. And I remember this pretty distinctly. It was Michael who really knew what Star Trek was supposed to be and what Star Trek was about. And he said, look, guys, this is really funny. He said, but first of all, I don't know why you're calling it symbiogenesis. It needs to be called Tuvix. We had named the character, but we hadn't named, he said, the show needs to be called Tuvix because that's who it's about. And he said, and you're missing the big Star Trek moral dilemma here. And the big Star Trek moral dilemma is that a brand new individual, an entirely new person is created out of this transporter accident, and Janeway's the captain, and she's going to have to decide whether to save her two crew members who are now no longer extant, no longer existing, whether to save them. She's willing to kill the new guy.
Well, because she just did the Starfleet thing, which is she sought out new life, and she found it. And now, right, so that's actually the point that I'm really interested in is that, okay, every TV show is a collaboration. And yes, your name is on the teleplay and you have other names of the story pitch, but you've got a staff of writer producers there who really know their stuff. And if Michael Piller is the one who came back to you and said, well, we need to actually get into the moral heart of this.
Yeah.
So what was that discussion like then? Because I think one of the most interesting things about the episode, you fast forward to the end and you've got crew members feeling betrayed, feeling helpless. I go back and watch that scene on the bridge and it's kind of like, well, everybody's scared to death to raise their voices. And here's Janeway just stepping in, doing her thing, even against the doctor's wishes. Like it's powerful stuff. So what does this debate look like to get there?
It was, well, first of all, it's very powerful. I rewatched the episode a couple of years ago, maybe during lockdown or something. Mm-hmm. I rewatched many of the episodes of the show. And it's very powerful, I have to say. And directed by Cliff Bowl, I believe. Mm-hmm. The ending is particularly powerful, where Janeway just makes the decision and walks away, and you have this character begging for his life, and Janeway makes this really difficult decision. I think there was probably a little bit of back and forth, because I think the original idea was, well, they're scientists. They're going to come up with a way to save their two crew members, and they do. And, we have some fun with this new character along the way, but it's, his time has come, and he's really a combination of both of them. So it's totally fine for our brilliant scientists to come up with a risky way to separate it and of course, get us our two crew members back. Mm-hmm. But I think it was, again, it was really Michael who said, well, hey, but this is not just a combination of these two guys. We're saying he's a completely new person. So what about his rights? Does he have the right to life? And that just made it, of course, so much more interesting. So I think that it was a little debate at first. I think I'm guessing. I don't remember, but
yeah, sure.
I probably thought my little comedy episode was pretty spiffy the way it was. But I think ultimately, Michael spoke with some moral authority about what we should do. And probably, it probably was, Jerry Taylor, who by the time was the active day-to-day boss. It was a small staff. In the first couple of seasons, it was really me and Brandon and Jerry and Michael. And then Michael moved on, and Lisa Klink came on. I think Lisa. It's hard for me to remember who was on the show when, but Lisa Klink came on, and much later, Brian Fuller and Michael Taylor. But it was a very small staff at the beginning, so it probably wasn't a long debate. And I think once I got into sort of rewriting it and saying, okay, I have to embrace this idea, it became much more interesting to me. What is she going to do? It is an awful dilemma. So on the one hand, obviously you can say, well, this person is an individual. He has a right to life. But the other responsibility of a Starfleet captain is the lives of her crew. And she had lost two crew members. And so they were effectively dead or going to be dead if this guy Tuvix continued to live. So do you sacrifice one to save two? And are you saving those two because you have a longstanding personal relationship with them? And, Tuvok was established as one of Janeway's oldest friends. And obviously she was extremely fond of Neelix almost from the get-go. And did she just like those guys more than she liked Tuvix? I don't think that's probably true. But what the episode became was watching this character of Tuvix, who emerges very confused about who he is, I think, and where he is and what's happened, becoming an individual, and that's classic Star Trek, right? And it's Data, right? Is Data a human being or is he a machine? But not exactly the same. And this became very unique. And I did not really understand, I think I said it, I guess, until many years later that, there was blowback in some way from this. Janeway's a murderer. Janeway killed somebody. And I guess she did, I guess she really did. But I think that, me personally, I'll take the hit on this. I mean, I think that what else could she have done? Her alternative, and she knew she was going to have to live with that, right? And she was going to have to take that on. And that's that last image of her, sort of walking into a close-up from out of sickbay. And you see that she's really carrying the weight of this because, and this is what leaders have to do sometimes. Leaders have to, make decisions that, we know that Starfleet is not a military organization, but military officers often have to make decisions that they know are going to get their crew members killed, and they have to weigh the balance and they have to live with the consequences. So, I guess in retrospect, I kind of wish that if the show had been allowed to be a little more serialized, I don't know if we would have thought of this, but in retrospect, if I can go back, I think it would have been really interesting to do an episode where, Janeway was having nightmares, about having, maybe she was haunted by Tuvix, and or something like that would have been interesting. And then of course we could find out that there were remnants of him in the transporter buffers or something. Like there'd be a scientific explanation like that would have been kind of cool. So yeah, I wasn't aware at the time. This was before. I mean, I guess there probably were message boards back then, but I certainly wasn't somebody who went and looked for the audience's reaction to things, and so I it was a surprise to me.
Well, I mean, among the very clever choices that are made in that script, you have a situation where mostly on Voyager, mostly on all of Star Trek, the action takes place within maybe several hours or a few days, and basically from week to week, a week has gone by, right? Yeah. But in this episode, it's a matter of several weeks into months. So we're really reinforced as the audience to know this is a new crew member who brings something unique to the rest of Voyager, right? So that's something that's a very cool choice.
I think that's a really interesting point and something frankly I had forgotten about. But as you're saying it to me, I remember that now. I'm reminded that I think my feeling very strongly, and maybe some of my pushback initially to this idea of making it about this big moral dilemma was, well, I mean, they go down to a planet, they get fused together by the transporter, the crew is going to figure out pretty quickly, because they're smart people. If they can do it, they can undo it. And it's not going to be a big mystery to the audience that they're going to be able to undo it. So it sort of became a narrative necessity to do what we often didn't do, which was to suggest a passage of time.
Yeah.
We did that sometimes on Voyager, where we would say like, the crew has been stuck in this starless void for months, where we would sort of jump and say a lot of time has taken place. It was the year of hell. There was all, those kinds of ideas that we would play with on occasion. In this case, you're absolutely right. The idea of it was to not only to make it more, let's say, believable that this character's personality as an individual, his interests, his feelings, his friendships, and his relationships would have some time to develop, and that the crew would have time to develop relationships with him so that it would be meaningful when the decision was going to have to be made about whether we were essentially going to erase this guy from existence.
Right.
Okay?
Well, I mean, the script really sells it because you have the competing pressure there of like, okay, we only have 45 minutes to tell the story. And at the end of that 45 minutes, next week's credits need to have Ethan Phillips and Tim Russ. It can't have this other character, Tuvix. But, you just said, and this I feel like is always the question in retrospect when looking at Voyager, if only we were more serialized, if only we had the ability to tell these long-form stories.
Yeah.
And of any series, Voyager is really the one that lends itself to that because you have this ongoing series-long arc. I mean, is that a place of, I have nothing you do about it now, but a place of frustration?
Look, it was a much different time in television. One that, by the way, we might be edging back into now, but it was Voyager launched a brand new network, and the thinking, of course, at the time was that every episode, and this I think was true of most shows at the time, every show had to be self-contained because they wanted the audience to, there was research that said even regular viewers of shows might only watch every third or fourth episode, and that if you created too much serialization, you would lose audience members who would tune into an episode and say, I don't know what's going on. This was a criticism that was leveled against Deep Space Nine, as I'm sure you well know, which is an incredible show, which was much more serialized. And that was the idea of that show, was that it was going to be much more serialized. And Michael and Rick and Ira Bear and Ron and Renee and all those guys really dug into the serialization of the political turmoil and all of those other storylines on that show. We were always a little bit jealous, I think, on Voyager that there was really a mandate that we could not do that because we were doing 20 and some in most of the seasons 26 episodes, and the network and Paramount were very adamant that the show needed to be serialized. It was a source of frustration for the cast, I think. I'm sure you've interviewed many people on the cast, and they would occasionally complain about what they called the reset button. We're starting a new episode and we have to act as though nothing that came before actually happened. And the exception to this came finally in season 7 when I prevailed on Rick Berman and I guess by extension UPN and Paramount, that look, it was the final season of the show. Mm-hmm. People who were still watching the show were invested in the show. As you pointed out, of course it's a serialized show because it's a crew that gets, it's not the original series or Next Gen where, they're just out on a mission. Right. They're boom, boom, boom. They're going from place to place. But they have a long arc story, which is how the hell are we going to get home? Mm-hmm. And so, I was able to, convince them that we could do things like get Tom and B'Elanna married and see how that would play out. Introduce Neelix to some Talaxians because I wanted some surprises at the end of the show, like maybe not everybody's going to get home, and it, like you said, the audience is saying, well, of course Tim Russ and Ethan Phillips are going to be in the credits next week. There's no chance that, right? Which takes some of the tension away from the show. Like if you think of a show like Game of Thrones, where you kill Sean Bean when nobody knows it's coming. Yeah. Like it's incredible drama, and so that wasn't really like available to us, and so it's only in this conversation with you that I thought, oh well, wouldn't it have been really interesting to have Janeway haunted by that character, or to see the repercussions of that play out. So in that sense, it's interesting as well. Yeah,
I feel like as we get into the big picture discussion of the TV landscape in the late 90s and to that, this is really Earl's forte. But I will leave the Tuvix discussion with one last question.
Sure.
Ken, what would you have done. So did you indeed write your ending, or did you write Janeway's ending?
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I think the job of a television writer is to say, what would the character do? And that was always Michael Pillar's mantra. And in fact, it was his mantra not just about behavior, but also about plotting. Because if you would get stuck and wonder, well, what should happen next in the show, Michael would always say, well, don't tell me that the ship gets stuck in a crater and they can't get out. Just tell me, if you want to know what's going to happen, tell me what the character would do next. So I'm certain, again, it's been 30 years, but I'm certain at the time I was saying to myself, we were saying to ourselves, what would Janeway do in this situation? And how do we make it as difficult for her as possible to make that decision? And one of the mantras of the Roddenberry universe, which was always really, really challenging as a writer, is, drama comes out of conflict, right? But these characters were supposed to be so evolved that they didn't really have conflict with each other. Of course they did, but of course they did. Right. But so, that made it very hard sometimes to create tension and drama in a scene, because it all comes out of conflict. So, having different crew members have different points of view about something that really was life or death and so individualistic made it interesting to write those scenes. But to go back to the answer to your question, I think I wrote what Janeway would do. I think that probably, we are certainly not the only writers to have explored this. I mean, it's Sophie's Choice, right? I mean, it's Meryl Streep in a flashback. Right. What am I going to do? I've got 2 babies and I can only save one.
Right.
So I think I probably would have made the decision that Janeway did. I can save 2 individuals, or I can, save one.
Yeah.
And I probably would have saved 2, and I probably would have been haunted the rest of my life.
Let me ask a question about the serialization, because it's important, because we have whole generations of viewers now who have binge watched on streaming or on DVD or what have you, and weren't there in real time and didn't have the context of necessarily what else was on TV. Serialization was a very new flavor at this point in the 90s, especially going into, the science fiction action hours.
Yeah.
You said that that it was really more of a network decision to avoid serialization.
Yes.
That's interesting, because they approved a show that had built-in, first off, it had a win condition. They were either going to get home, that's the win condition, or not.
Mm. Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
And, also had conflict built in the form of, we have picked up this whole other crew who are not, their goals are not aligned with ours. Yeah. It's like, wait a minute, have you guys even looked at the show you've bought from us?
Earl, you're expecting logic and rational thinking from network executives?
No, I am absolutely not, because at the time I was working at a UPN station. I know better.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a logic to it. It was a business decision. It was, we're trying to sell soap and cars, and we want to make sure that people tune in. I mean, there's the thinking began to shift, of course, which is, well, maybe if the people really want to, if the audience really wants to know what happens next, they'll be more likely to tune in, next week. As you rightly point out, this was, I mean, we had, VHS, we had Blockbuster, but there wasn't really the possibility to binge a show, or to just, you had to wait for the DVD set to come out or something, right? You couldn't really watch the whole thing. So it was very dependent on tune in. And I've left out a very important part of that, reruns.
Yeah.
Right. Because we were making 26 a year, but there's 52 weeks in a year. So they want to make sure if they want people to tune into a rerun, they can just say, oh, I'll just watch an episode of Voyager this afternoon at 5 p.m. whenever it's on at at your local station, and it won't matter if I saw what happened next. So that might have been an even more important part of it, had to do with the value of the show in repeats, in syndication,
Right.
And that was so much more of the business model. Right now these shows are monetized, not enough, which is part of what's wrong with our business, but they're monetized by subscription fees and obviously still some advertising. But at the time, the way that Paramount Pictures monetized a show like that was that they got paid a license fee by UPN to air the show for a certain number of times, but then they could sell it to ancillary markets who could repeat it, and the value of that was thought to be much higher for these individual episodes if there wasn't a requirement of audience familiarity in order to get the audience to watch a repeat.
Yeah,
so I think that had a lot more to do with it. There's always been serialization, obviously. Dickens was serialized in newspapers in London, and talk about selling soap. They're called soap operas because they're selling soap on a daily basis. But those shows weren't created to repeat necessarily, right? If you didn't watch Days of Our Lives, you weren't going to go back and watch a Days of Our Lives episode from a couple of years ago. So, and by the way, I do think there probably is some value now in even for somebody like me who worked on the show, all those episodes of the show, who doesn't even remember it that well. And if I happen to be flipping through the channels and I go, oh, there's a Voyager episode on it, turn it on, and I don't have to think about what happened last week. I just, enjoy oh, that was a cool story. Oh, those aliens were cool. Yes, that was an interesting idea. So, but as writers, it's much more fun to work on a serialized show. So, and I'm sure for the actors as well. I know that to be true.
Mentioned Michael Piller kind of setting the pivot point that redirected what Tuvix was going to be.
Yeah.
And you kind of mentioned that sort of his role was more or less as the moral arbiter of the Roddenberry values, which is, what our podcasts are all about here. That is what we are looking for in each show. What can you tell us about him, in that role?
Oh, well, what I can tell you about Michael is, he was really brilliant. He himself was an extremely, moral, ethical human being. I think, in his life, he really probably, embodied those ideals. He was like a truly good person. He wasn't the warmest person, just in terms of his personality, but he was extremely ethical. I really looked up to him, really admired him. He taught me a lot about writing. He really trained, if you think about it, a whole generation of showrunners.
Yeah.
Ron Moore, Narayan Shankar, Renee Echevarria, myself, Brian Fuller. I think by the time Brian got there, Michael had taken a more advisory role, but for the first, I think it was the first 2 seasons of Voyager. It might have only been the first one, but certainly, I'm pretty sure for the first 2 seasons, Michael was, along with Jerry, really running it. He was in every story break, and he was the one who really taught me how to break a story, and all those other guys. But in terms, and he felt very strongly and passionately about this. The Star Trek ethos. And to be perfectly honest with you, when I got there, I was not a huge Star Trek fan. In other words, I'd seen the movies. I used to watch the original series in reruns sometimes at my cousin's house because my cousins were kind of into it. But I wasn't a Star Trek guy, and so I as a young writer, I struggled at times and bristled against this very rigid idea of how people could behave, because I found it really difficult to generate conflict and interest, and I just thought, well, they're human beings. They're gonna have flaws. They're gonna and Michael was very adamant that his job was to carry the torch of the Roddenberry vision of the show. And of course, over time, I realized that was my job too, and my responsibility, and I came to appreciate it much more as I realized, how important it was to the fans. And while you might sacrifice something in the storytelling, what you were gaining was this kind of hopeful, optimistic vision of the future that people really could behave in ways that were ethical. Some of our favorite television, of course, is people who behave in horribly unethical ways. The Sopranos, what a great show, right? I mean, but you're not coming to Star Trek for that. Michael really, I think, felt a responsibility to the Roddenberry legacy, let's say.
I've heard different writers kind of size that up in different ways. And if we speak in very general terms, that Roddenberry ethos about, a positive, inclusive view of the future, this kind of aspirational look at humanity. But when it came down to the nuts and bolts of writing shows, well, you mentioned a moment ago, there is a lack of inter-character conflict, at least the kind that we're used to seeing in shows that are built solely on that kind of inter-character conflict. Yeah. So as a writer, then, do you see that more as a help or a hindrance? I've heard Brannon say before, well, in some ways that's a help because then the guidelines and that I'm exploring in this area over here as opposed to these other places that are probably better explored on other shows.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brandon's right. I mean, I think having rules when you're working quickly and having to turn out stories and scripts every week, is helpful, and it helps you write those characters and that show well because that's what the show is, and obviously it's endured for decades and it's very popular and people love it, and so there's clearly an appetite and an audience for it. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I wish we could live in this Roddenberry future. I look around today and I think, God, wouldn't it be great if we all could have a little more, inclusivity and get along and not be at each other's throats and have less conflict, less war, less all of it. Don't get me started. But yeah, I mean, you learn it. It's a skill, it's a craft. And you learn you learn how to do it. I suppose, if you're I don't mean to reduce it to a factory, because obviously very creative minds make very unique incarnations of this show, but I suppose it would be like you're working in a Murano glass factory, and Murano glass has particular characteristics, and you need to work within those characteristics. And if you want to make some other kind of glass, Tiffany glass, then you go work for Tiffany, I guess. I think both things are true. I think in some ways it made it more difficult because you could imagine an incredible scene between two characters really going at it. And when we had those scenes of conflict where they could have conflict with people who were not on their ship or not their friends, or they things could really sing, So, and of course there was conflict in the show, I mean, but not in the way that we think of, to use my other example, Tony Soprano going at it with his wife, right? I mean, that's, Well,
I was kind of looking back at some of my favorites in your Voyager tenure, the ones that have your name as either, story or a teleplay credit.
Sure.
And some of the ones that I picked out that I think are really dependent upon character, kind of a character deep dive, character analysis. Jetrel is, Neelix's character deep dive. The Shoot, which we just discussed not that long ago as being one of Harry Kim's best episodes. 30 Days, of course, we throw Tom in the clink, and say what you will about Tom Paris, maybe not having always the best episodes, but he got his moment there. Prophecy, Human Error, which is just another one of many fantastic looks at what makes Seven so unique in that humanistic journey.
Sure.
So is this a particular area that you like to play in as a writer, or are these things that just kind of became apparent as you got to know these characters and said, oh, wait, I really want to go there with that one?
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, it always starts with character, and I enjoy and pride myself on being able to create interesting and twisty, turny plots. But the most interesting stuff, of course, is always is the character. Is the humanity of the characters, and so yeah, I think I gravitate toward toward interesting characters and interesting moral dilemmas and those kinds of things. You probably would have to remind me of the plots of some of those, like your titles don't necessarily automatically. Betrayal, I remember because it was the name of a character, and I think it was like the first or second episode that I wrote. But and of course I remember the shoot very well. And by the way, one of the ways that if you want to say, like, kind of get around like the Roddenberry rules, is if you put these characters in these extraordinary circumstances where they are forced or maybe forced or are challenged to have to maybe abandon these principles that they've been taught in order to survive, because is the survival instinct stronger, or is this moral instinct stronger? And then of course I think we did, you do things like there's something technological that's happening to these characters that's changing their behavior in some way, and that's often what we would do is the characters are changed by circumstances, and that maybe allows their behavior to stray from the straight and narrow Starfleet way of behaving. Yeah. So I think I would probably gravitate sometimes toward those sorts of things. And, and of course, once Jerry came on the show, that character was so interesting to write, because like the most interesting Star Trek characters, like the Doctor, like Data, she is exploring her humanity and trying to figure out what does it mean to be a human being. So, I think I probably gravitated toward those kinds of stories. But to be really honest, you're trying to come up with 26 stories a year, and sometimes you come up with them, and sometimes somebody comes in and pitches them, or sometimes one of your colleagues comes up with one, or you're just brainstorming and you're like, wow, that's a cool idea. I can see how we can create a whole episode out of that with plenty of conflict and plenty of scenes. Like, let's do it. And then you get into it, and it's that was also fun about Star Trek. Some of the episodes were sort of more actiony, which I always enjoyed as well, and some of them were more cerebral, and that's what made it fun.
Yeah. That speaks to kind of the strength of the episodic nature of any of the Star Trek series up to this point, is that it isn't all just one thing. And yes, there are the high-minded, moralistic episodes. There are the purely action-adventure episodes. But then you look into it, and I was pleasantly surprised, as I said on our first wrap-up show not that long ago, that Neelix, I had the same reaction in the rewatch that people had back when the show was airing for the first time, which is, why is the, alien clown on board, and how soon can we be done with this character? But then an episode like Jetrel comes along, and I go, oh, wait a minute, that actually informs now everything before and after. So I get to keep that along with me for the rest of the ride and go, okay, there's some really interesting, deep character stuff happening here.
Yeah, he was a character dealing with existential trauma.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's not just kind of happy-go-lucky, kind of goofy,
Sure.
And I think there were some great Neelix episodes, and it became a really interesting character. I think some of the early... Again, I wasn't really paying attention to or even aware of how, like, audience reaction in real time. It's only kind of like in retrospect. I mean, I can tell you that I thought coming onto the show, I was thrilled to have this job and be working on this show, but I thought, even though I thought Kess was actually a really interesting character, and I wrote a couple of Kess episodes that are some of my favorites, that the relationship between Neelix and Kess was kind of weird and creepy and odd, and we had a character who was supposed to be like 2 years old, just a old dude, and she's kind of his girlfriend, but like what, like it was just, like that was just kind of weird, and I think that might have set a tone for Neelix that the character had to kind of overcome as we moved forward.
Well, let me ask you this, and Earl, this kind of goes back to your strength, looking at the overall, production landscape at the time, which is, all right, today we're making shows that are 10 episodes a season, and they're already done, edited, ready to air by the time the third season is being made. So there isn't any room for fan feedback, reflection whatsoever. Now, as a writer and, writer-producer, you don't want to get deeply mired in what everybody else is saying as you're trying to create a show. But is there room, and particularly in a show like Voyager, was there room for course correction when you can get to the middle of a season and go, wait a minute, we haven't really done this character right. Let's circle back around and fix it. Yeah,
we were able to do that, and we would say, "Oh my God, we haven't." Of course, I'm sure you talk about it. We don't have any Chakotay episodes. We don't have a.
Well, that's fine.
Sorry, you guys are very honest. I like it. You guys are very honest.
Yeah. Well,
I think I don't know how much of that was based on fan feedback as much as being able to watch finished episodes of the show during, if you're shooting 26 episodes, like by the time you're probably breaking episode 18, you've gotten to see all these episodes.
Yeah.
Pardon me. And you've gotten to see which character combinations work and which kind of break out. And, we realize, the Doctor and Seven of Nine are great together. So suddenly that becomes a dynamic that you want to write to. Neelix and Tuvok are funny when they have to do something together. So yeah, it definitely gives you time to do that. I mean, I've obviously done both. I'm working on a very old fashioned show right now. I'm sitting right now. I'm at Paramount Pictures, right around the corner from the Hart Building, which is where we used to write as writers.
Right.
And I am working for my former assistant, Rob Doherty, who of course became a writer on Voyager. He was my assistant.
Yeah.
I got married on this lot. He met his wife on this lot, and a few months ago he created a show that got picked up by ABC, very old-fashioned case of the week detective show with a little serialized elements called R.J. Decker. It's going to be on ABC.
Right.
And we got these offices at Paramount. He said, "Do you want to come help me out on the show?" So I'm consulting on the show. I'm writing an episode. I'm directing an episode. It's super fun. So, this is part of what I was saying is I think that even on some of the streamers now, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. I have an opinion, but a lot of the storytelling now and what the distributors, whether they're streamers or networks or whatever, are buying are much more old fashioned, less serialized story of the week. It's back in vogue.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I have really preferred, I shouldn't say preferred, I have really enjoyed working on shows that are more serialized. But I'm having fun doing this. So it's two different muscles, really, I guess. Yeah.
It's been said in various publications, interviews down through the years that, if the ratings had ever stopped looking quite so shiny, Voyager would have been brought back to the Alpha Quadrant earlier, before the end of the show. And I was wondering if that was ever actually a discussion or if that's just something that's been floating in the rumor mill for years.
I don't ever remember it being discussed in response to or in relation to ratings. Certainly there were moments when we were breaking stories or it was the beginning of a new season and we were thinking like, what could we do that's crazy and different? Could we really mix it up? And I believe that I don't think these things were considered that extensively or that long, but I know that there were moments where we were like, okay, well, what we're doing season 7. What if we just surprise the audience and in the first episode, we're just back, and now we play out there was a two-parter, I think, like in the 5th season where Voyager ended up back in present day Los Angeles.
Yeah.
But that started with the discussion of actually the ratings, I think, had like dipped a little bit. And it was like, is there something we can do to jazz it up? And in my recollection anyway, I said, well, okay, what if we just, what if there was a weird temporal anomaly and the ship ended up back in present day and they were stuck there, and we play out a whole season where they had to hide and figure out, the show's about getting home. Can they even get back to, to their own time? And then it was like, well, maybe we could do that for like a few episodes. And of course, it, got whittled down to a 2-parter that Joe and Brandon ended up writing, if I'm not mistaken. But so, we would talk about those kinds of big swings. I remember we talked about, getting home in, 4 episodes before the end, or again, like, at the end of a season, or getting home and then realizing you weren't really home, so when you're trying to do that many episodes and you're trying to figure out how to end it and how to end it with, okay, well, everybody's expecting you to get home. And so how do you mix it up and do something the audience didn't expect? And out of that is what came the idea for the ending of the show, which is, well, yeah, let's start the beginning of the end and they're already home, and the audience is like, wait, what did we miss? How did they get home? They've been home for a while. But what you realize, again, going back to Captain Janeway, she wants to save her crew. She got home, but not everybody made it. And so you got to go back and try to redo it. So that's, that's how that came about. And so there for sure there were discussions, whether there were discussions like above my pay grade with like Rick Berman and the network about, hey, the show's not doing that well, so just get it home. I don't know. I mean, I've had the experience on a couple of other shows where you write something that you think is a season finale with all sorts of with a cliffhanger at the end for, with all sorts of ideas for what's going to happen in the next season. And you find out, oh, sorry, that was your series finale, So I don't know that anybody would have maybe had the foresight to that. I think there might have been a scenario where, we all serve at the pleasure of these networks and streamers who finance these shows, where they just decided we're not going to spend any money to make anymore. And, that would have been a shame, but it could have happened, I suppose.
Since that has come up a few times in here, I have a little bit of a zinger question here for you.
Sure.
You've worn a lot of hats. You've had quite a career. I mean, you've written, you've directed. I could almost just drive us off a cliff talking about going from writing to directing, because that's a very different career, man.
Sure.
But your work has stretched from, when we had baby networks that were programming a couple of nights a week.
Yeah.
Into, now they're all real networks and they're programming the whole week. And now the networks are fading out. Now everything is streaming. When, in your opinion, was it kind of the best time to be a creative in the industry? Was it then? Was it now?
Oh, well, I don't mean to be, I don't want to be like, oh, in the good old days, like those guys. But I think, for me anyway, the end of the 2010s leading up to, our horrible worldwide nightmare of the pandemic, for me anyway, it was a really creatively fertile period where I made a couple of seasons of my show called Genius, and I had a show called Perception on TNT with Eric McCormick. I mean, that for me was the best, where I had sort of the most creative control, where streamers and networks were spending money and they were willing to do things that were that seemed a little bit riskier. I got to make a show about Albert Einstein. I mean, that was amazing. And I got to go to and shoot it all over Europe. Like that was incredible. I think that I guess it's the era of what people called peak TV, where maybe I think it got to be too much, and so quality started to suffer, and that's part of the demise that we're seeing now. But I think for me, the best time was probably the late 2010s, from say 2015 to 2020, and then lots of bad things happened in 2020, as we all know. And I've worked on some interesting things since then, but been stuck in a lot of development hell, and been involved in projects that were big projects that were conceived before the economics of the business really started to shift, which they started to do, just within the last 5 years. And so, a lot of shows, that were terrific, wouldn't be made today. I don't think anybody's even Succession, for example. I don't think anybody's, gonna, there'll always be an outlier, but it would be very hard to get a show like Succession made. It'd be really hard to get a show like Mad Men made. It'd be really hard to get a show like, The Sopranos or Breaking Bad or The Americans, which was one of my favorite shows. So I'm a little bit nostalgic, for those days, but I'm still plugging away, still trying to make shows, and still hoping to, have a couple more shots at it.
I think we can wrap it up there, Earl, unless there's anything else you need, because otherwise I'm just going to gush about Critical Care and how that is a killer episode.
Isn't that so very timely,
man,
today?
I tell you, I vaguely remember watching it first run or shortly after, and it is remarkable how a show can come back and just sort of bite you right in the ass 25 years later, and you go, oh, wow. Either he was really onto something, purposely or kind of magically to make something even more relevant today than it was when it first aired.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that. I do remember that one by the title.
Yeah, look, enjoy may not be the right word, but I was struck by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of that. I don't remember the name of the episode, but there's an episode that I wrote about B'Elanna being on a planet where she gets arrested for having a violent thought because violent thoughts have been outlawed. So it's like that's what you could do in science fiction on Star Trek. Like, it was literally about the thought police.
Yeah,
like what if we were judged by the thoughts we had in our head versus the actions that we took.
Ken, it's just science fiction. That kind of thing. It doesn't happen in real life. You know that.
Yeah. So, I mean, so much of Star Trek is what was great about Star Trek is being able to kind of take on those sort of interesting questions and interesting notions. But I'll have to go back and rewatch Critical Care and see how close we got it.
Uncomfortably close,
but
incredibly close.
We're the only country in the world where people go bankrupt over medical bills. So
exactly.
Yep.
Yeah, but that one's for the ages. That one speaks to the
age. And we could be a little bit subversive. We could be a little bit subversive on those shows. I mean, I'm everything has been really sound like an old lefty, but corporatized and globalized and I'm realizing now, even working on a network show, there are things that if we were to propose doing as an episode, they would just tell us to stay away from it. Not because they necessarily have a particular agenda of their own, but they just no controversy, So I thought it was cool that we could get away with some of that stuff. And what was cool about Star Trek was people could have different points of view, and the best writing is when somebody makes a point and you say, well, that guy is right, and then this woman stands up and she makes another point. She said, wait, she's right, and that's the best kind of stuff. And so
very cool.
Maybe we'll get to make some more shows like that. I hope so.
This is a Roddenberry podcast. For more great podcasts, visit podcast.roddenberry.com.